This tutorial will cover the basics of using SVN from the command line. There are other free programs, such as Tortoise SVN, that allow you to use a graphical interface to access your SVN repository, but I recommend that you understand how to use SVN from the command line as well. Every student in the CS department at USF has an SVN repository, and the URL of that repository looks like this. So notice that we use HTTPS and not just HTTP, and then the URL is www.cs.usfca.edu/svn/your username. The SVN list command will allow you to see the contents of that repository. In this case, I have 3 directories inside of my main repository. For each class you take at USF, you will want to create a new directory to store your code and other work for that class. You can use the SVN make directory command to create a new directory. So the SVN make directory command is specified like this and requires that you type the URL of the new directory. So notice I've tacked on CS112 to the end of the previous URL. In addition, I need to use the -m flag and in quotation marks specify a message that indicates what I'm trying to do with this particular command. The more specific this message is, the better, as you can use it later, you can refer back to it later to figure out what you've done at a particular revision of your repository. So now if I go back and use the SVN list command again, I notice that the CS112 directory has been added to my main repository. So when I use the SVN make directory command, I make changes to the repository stored on the SVN server, but I don't make any changes to my local file system. So notice there are no new files or directories stored on my file system. So once I've created a new directory on the server and I want to work on files locally that are going to be stored in that directory, I need to use the SVN checkout command to check out a copy of that directory. So I use SVN CO, which stands for checkout, and then I specify the URL, in this case including the CS112 because that's the particular directory I want to check out. So once I've checked out that directory, I notice that a copy of that directory has been made on my local file system. So now that I have a CS112 directory on my local file system, this is where I'm going to store all of my code and work for CS112. So if I change into the CS112 directory, I can, for example, create a new directory for Lab 1, and inside of the directory for Lab 1, create a new test.java file, let's suppose. So once I have made any change to my local file system, that is, I have added any new files or directories, or I have modified the contents of the files on my file system, I need to use the SVN add command to add any new files and directories, and then I need to use the SVN commit command to make sure any changes I have made locally are pushed to the server. So in this particular case, the first thing I will do is use the SVN add command to add the Lab 1 directory. Now you'll notice that if I list the contents of the CS112 directory on the server, it's still empty. Because even though I've added this new directory, I need to do a commit in order for those changes to be reflected. So I will use the SVN commit command to commit all of the changes that I have made. When I use the SVN commit command, I again need to use the -m flag and specify a detailed message indicating what I'm trying to do in this particular transaction. So now all of my changes have been sent to the server. If I want to verify that my changes have been stored on the server, or if I simply want to work on this particular, in this case Lab 1, from a different machine, I can do that. So let's look at how we might do that by logging into another machine. So I'll switch to another terminal window, and then I'll use the SSH command to log in remotely to another machine. So if I SSH into stargate.cs.usfca.edu, I will connect to the gateway machine that I can access from anywhere off campus. And in my case, I need to use a different username to log in, and I'll do that using the -L flag. So if you read this notice here, what this says is that you need to log in from Stargate to another machine, either one of the machines in the Cudlick classroom or one of the machines in the Harney 5th floor labs. So if I type our users -A, this will tell me which machines are available, which machines are up, and which machines already have folks logged into them. So let's suppose I want to choose to use this particular machine. I would then log into that machine. And now I'm logged in remotely, and I can do a checkout of the CS112 directory from the SVN repository. So for this example, I'm going to create a new directory, SVN test, and then I'm going to do an SVN checkout of my CS112 directory. So you'll notice all of the changes that I've made, all of the directories and files that I've added to my repository are downloaded onto my local system. So now, here on this particular machine, I have a local copy of all of my data. So let's suppose I make a couple of changes. I'm going to lab 1, and then let's suppose that in test.java, I add a new method and then let's suppose I add another class. So once I make any change, I need to make sure that I add any new files and I commit all of my changes to the repository. So let's suppose that I simply do an SVN commit, and I specify that I added a main method to test.java and added a new class, another test. So I might see right here that there's something wrong, because I don't see that the file another test.java was actually sent to the server. I only see that test.java and the changes that I made there were sent to the server. So if I go back to my original terminal window and I do an SVN update, I just simply type SVN up and it will pull down any changes that have been made. So if I go into lab 1, I see that test.java is there, and the changes that I made to test.java are reflected, but another test.java is not there. The reason is because every time I add a new directory or a new file, I have to do an SVN add. So in this case, I can do an SVN add of another test.java, and then after I've done an add, I need to do another commit. So now that I've done another commit, if I do an SVN update back on my original system, another test.java will be pulled down from the server. Another interesting command you can use is SVN log. An SVN log will show you all of the changes that you've made on the repository. So you see the date and time of each change and the message that you specified with each change. So this can be helpful if you make changes to your code and you inadvertently break something. You can perhaps go back to a previous version.